Well, good morning and welcome to WAFER, the Washington Area Forum on Economic Reform. WAFER is a year-old series of events that provide a chance for people to get together and talk about issues of international economic reform. WAFER is co-convened by Mario Bleier at the World Bank, Max Corden of Johns Hopkins, Bob Littan of Brookings Institution, Mansur Olson of the University of Maryland, Larry Summers at the World Bank, Vito Tanzi at the IMF, and John Williamson of the Institute for International Economics. Some of the past WAFER events, which many of you have attended, have involved people such as MIT professor Stanley Fischer, Alexander Yakovlev, the former advisor to former President Gorbachev, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, agricultural economist Yohiro Hayami, and Sergei Kalishnikov, Special Advisor to Acting Prime Minister Gaidar. Today's event is supported by the University of Maryland Distinguished Professor Fund and the Designated Research Institute Fund. The topic for the day is, Will America Regain Economic Leadership? At this time, we're also launching the FIND Forum on International Development, which many of you will have picked up a sheet on. We'll tell you more about that later. I'd like to turn the meeting over to John Holum, who will be the chair for this event. Mr. Holum is now special counsel at the law firm of O'Melveny and Myers. He has an illustrious background as an expert in foreign policy and defense, having formerly served on the policy planning staff of the State Department during the Carter administration. More recently, he's been an active advisor to Governor Clinton during the campaign as a foreign policy and defense advisor, a member of the Exploratory Committee, and the executive director of the Platform Committee for the Democratic Convention. John, go ahead.
As you've noticed, I'm not an economist, which is rare on this panel, but we meet at a portentous moment for economists. We have a president-elect who has said that he intends to focus on the economy with a laser beam-like intensity. And we have a distinguished group of people to help start the debate or continue the debate on economic policy as we move forward. We're all here at a minimum because we agree with Will Rogers that an economist's guess is liable to be as good as anyone else's. But I'm here as a consumer, not a purveyor, obviously, of economics. I've been involved in the Clinton campaign, as Dr. Ryan said, as helping out in the areas of defense and foreign policy, and also was in charge of pulling the draft of the platform together. But when it came to, well, I was querulous and argumentative on every other subject that was brought into the platform. When it came to economics, I meekly and blindly accepted the mandates of Dr. Shapiro and the other economic advisors, and that's why Bill Clinton won the election. The title of this forum is, Will America Regain Economic Leadership at Home and Abroad? As a partisan, my answer to that is, of course it will. That was decided November 3rd. But we can't end the conference there because people of deeper knowledge and lesser faith might have a different view. Therefore, let's proceed to the first panel. I'll introduce the panelists individually as they appear, beginning with Dr. Mansur Olson. He's distinguished, first of all, because he shares with me a Scandinavian heritage and a Midwest origin, and also because he shares with Bill Clinton an Oxford background. Dr. Olson is a Harvard-trained economist, served in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the late 1960s. Now he's a distinguished professor of economics at the University of Maryland at College Park. He serves as chair and principal investigator of the Center for Institutional Reform in the Informal Sector and as a consultant with Resources for the Future. He's the author of numerous works, including Logic of Collective Action and Rise and Decline of Nations in 1982. Dr. Olson. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John Holum. Fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. The question of the panel, will the United States regain economic leadership under a new president, has two parts. One part of the question is whether the United States economy will recover the dynamism that it once had, as recently even as the 1950s and 60s, when the economy's productivity grew at a far faster rate than it has since. But there's also the question of whether the United States will again come to play the constructive role in the world economy that it played at the time of the Marshall Plan, the Kennedy round of tariff cuts, and so on. Will these things occur under a new president? Now, one useful thing is to ask whether any other country has bounced back to recover its prior dynamism and gone on to new heights. And I believe that there are examples of countries that have done exactly that. Consider, for example, Germany and Japan at the end of World War II. These countries were not only far, far below the level they had been at before the war, but their situation was so poor that it was commonly thought, both by people in these countries and by detached observers from afar, that they might be, for the indefinite future, wards of the United States needing to be fed by us. But we know that instead of keeping in this bad state, these two economies enjoyed economic miracles and very quickly had reached their highest previous levels and then went on to unprecedented levels of economic development. So countries can bounce back and go way ahead of anywhere they've been before. Now, I think there are two reasons why Germany and Japan advanced so much in the first quarter century after World War II, and that these two reasons have lessons for us, the United States, and our policies now, for example, in the new administration. The first lesson, it seems to me, is that countries can move ahead rapidly only when there is an open and thriving world economy. In the quarter century after World War II, the world economy was thriving, but it was also all the time becoming more open to international trade and foreign investment. And that was terribly important to the Germans and the Japanese and the other economies that had extraordinary growth at that time. Part of that growth came from the extraordinary profit of their interaction with other countries, including us, especially us, and from foreign investment, the exchange of technology. And of course, the United States played an awfully large role in making sure that the world economy was one that was open and thriving in the first quarter century after World War II. It was in part our Marshall Plan, our Kennedy round of tariff cuts, other actions by us that accounted for the fact the world economy worked so well at that time. As it were, the United States realized then that it was such a large part of the world economy that if we made the world economy work better, then we gained from that. We saw our encompassing interest, our large stake in the prosperity of the world economy, and that made the world economy work better. It permitted economic miracles like those in Germany and Japan, and that in turn fed back to our own prosperity. That the economic miracles abroad were, as it were, one of the reasons why our economy grew so rapidly in the 50s and 60s compared to what it's done lately. Now, I think also there was a second reason why the German and Japanese economies grew so rapidly in the years after World War II, and that was that these countries suffered almost no depredations from special interest groups lobbying for special interest legislation or cartelizing markets, setting prices and wages at monopolistic levels. I believe that the absence of such special interest group activity was important for Germany and Japan, partly because of the incentives faced by organizations that are set up to lobby the government for some narrow interest in a particular industry or occupation, or to collude or cartelize markets. Any organization like that is normally small in relationship to the economy as a whole. let's say we talk about a typical organization set up to lobby or to collude, and suppose its members earn 1% of the market income in the society. Now, if this special interest group, through its lobbying for special interest legislation that distorts the efficiency of allocation of resources, or through colluding in a market, if it makes the economy less efficient, as in general it will, its members will bear only 1% of the loss from that inefficiency, because by assumption it represents only 1% of the income earning capacity of the country. But the group will get all of the amount that it has won through the lobbying or through the collusion and cartelization. So it pays a group like that, a narrow special interest group, it pays it to keep on trying to redistribute to itself through monopoly price and wage setting or through special interest legislation, up to the point where the national income falls by 100 times as much as this group wins in distributional struggle. Thus, if I might use again a metaphor that I'm fond of from my book on the Rise and Decline of Nations, a society dense with special interest groups is in a way like a china shop filled with wrestlers battling over its contents and breaking much more than they carry away. Now, Germany and Japan then were uniquely innocent of such groups at the end of World War II and in the first couple decades after. And the reason they were innocent of such groups at that time is that these groups take a long time to organize. After the totalitarianism and defeat in war, the old groups in these countries were destroyed. It takes a long while for new groups to get organized. And the reason is they have to overcome the difficulties of collective action. They have to overcome the fact that the benefits a special interest group provides to its constituents go to everyone in some occupation or industry, whether or not they've paid dues. They have the free rider problem. And that means they have to work out special gimmicks or selective incentives to get membership, and that takes a long time. From which it follows that only societies that have had a long period of stability will have accumulated lots of the special interest groups of which I speak. And only such societies will suffer the losses in economic dynamism that they bring about. Now, evidence for the argument that I've put forth is the fact that the longest stable society, Great Britain, has had an anomalously low rate of economic growth in modern times, even though it was the country that introduced economic growth in the first place with its industrial revolution. It has accumulated a lot of such organization, and its economy has tended to work badly under diverse governments or administrations. Now, the United States has had a rather long period of stability also, especially in the eastern, older, and older Middle Western parts of the country, which have enjoyed organization and stability for a long time. Our more recently settled West and the until the 50s or 60s generally unorganizable South have had fewer special interest groups, at least until lately. And as we know, the West and South have, as this argument predicts, grown far more rapidly than have Germany, has the northeastern and older Middle Western parts of the country. As it were, the West and South have been the Germany and Japan of our country. The Northeast and the older Middle West have been our England. Now, I would suggest that taking the United States as a whole, the problem of which I speak, the problem of special interest lobbying and collusion and cartelization, is very serious. And it's especially serious partly because of the way our Congress is selected and organized. We all know that each congressman or congresswoman only needs to win the election in his or her district or constituency in order to be successful. We know that our political parties are very weak and they cannot discipline in any important way the individual congressperson. So that means then that the political career of a congressman or congresswoman is best served by focusing entirely on their own district. To focus on pork for the district and to focus on getting the campaign contributions that enable the candidate to have lots of advertising in the congressional election. But of course, the campaign contributions come overwhelmingly from the special interests. So, however reluctantly or sadly, many congressmen then, especially those that have survived, have had to decide that above all, they must have voting records and patterns of action which favor the interest groups from which they seek contributions. We also see the concern about pork arising from the same kind of logic or arithmetic I mentioned with respect to special interest groups. A congressman's constituents will gain from a project in his district, normally, even if that project has national benefits only about 1/435th as great as the total costs, because the benefits of the project will be in the district, and the taxes will normally be national, and a typical congressional district will represent only 1/435th of the taxpayers of the society. So then, lobbying is particularly able to work in a Congress like ours because of the structure of our political system. So we then have to ask the question, is there any organization or individual in the U.S. political system that does not face the perverse incentives that I have just described, does not face the perverse incentives that confront special interest groups and the typical individual congressman or congresswoman? And the answer, of course, is there is one office that has a broader constituency and faces different incentives, and that's the office of the presidency. There's no way to win the presidency without getting more votes than any other candidate, and typically, the last election is a slight exception here, that means getting a majority of the whole electorate. But the whole electorate is a constituency which earns a large part of any majority that any president might get is such a large constituency, it earns a large part of the national income. As it were, the president's constituency is as broad in relationship to the United States as the United States was just after World War II in relationship to the world economy. The meaning of this is that in practice, there is no way for a president to serve his interest in re-election without making the economy as a whole work well. The president is the one politician such that the incentive he has is to make the economy work, because there's no narrower constituency worth mentioning that can elect him. So I therefore think that this is a time of hope. The problem we have had is that there haven't been, by and large, presidents so far that, as I see it, have understood the problem that I've described. But the incentives that a president faces are wholesome. They're incentives really to work in the national interest. And so I personally think this is a time of change and also a time when it is appropriate to have hope. It may be that my hope owes something to my optimism, to the fact I'm a Clinton supporter, but I do feel that this is at least a time when possibly things could get a lot better. But of course, they'll only get better if the president stands up, the next president stands up to special interest groups, including especially those in his own coalition. They present the bills very promptly, so it's the special interest groups allied with the winner that are normally the source of the most mischief in an administration. But it seems to me that President-elect Clinton will not only need to stand up to special interest groups in order to have the thriving economy that would re-elect him 4 years from now. It seems to me as well that he must note another feature of the situation that enabled Germany and Japan to enjoy their economic miracles. Recall that their extraordinary economic growth occurred at a time when the world economy was thriving and when it was increasingly open, when protectionist barriers were coming down. And that not only did countries like Germany and Japan gain extraordinarily from that, but so did we. Now, given the importance of the United States still in the world economy, it seems to me that the United States has an incentive to make the world economy work better by making the world economy more open, by making our own economy less protectionist. That helps us both directly, but also by helping the rest of the world, which in turn makes them a richer market for our products and a better source of supply. That by a proper policy, open with respect to trade, hospitable to foreign investment, and generous with aid, with a set of policies like that, making a thriving world economy, then the American economy can grow at incomparably more rapid rates than it could otherwise have grown. And I believe the international economy is so important to us, not only because of the great gains from trade and foreign investment and exchange of technology, it's also important for another reason. And that is that a worldwide open economy is the best protection there is against the depredation of special interest groups. There's no world government that lobbying organizations can lobby to fix world trade. If an individual country is completely open to foreign trade and to investment of other countries, then any collusion or cartel or lobby in that country that tries to favor local firms will have a great difficulty. There's no possibility of cartelizing a market and fixing a higher price than the world price if imports are available to the people in that country without any protection or tariff. So then, the wider world economy, an open world economy, is tied up also with reducing the depredations of special interest groups and making an economy more dynamic and efficient. So I believe that the tremendous introversion, natural introversion of the American electorate in the last months, last year or two, is an introversion that could in the end be very bad for the American people. But yes, our main concern is with the American economy that's the source of our own livelihoods. But no, we don't get the best American economy by focusing on the American economy alone. If we let catastrophe occur in the former Soviet Union, for example, we can be in for all sorts of troubles, some of them economic. If, by contrast, we could get the former Soviet Union to have institutions and arrangements which work the way the institutions and arrangements of Germany and Japan worked after World War II, that could set off a worldwide boom, which would be tremendously good for us. So I think, to make things better at home, we need to think also about trade and foreign investment and aid. The way to a better American economy, the way to regain American economic leadership, is not to focus on the American economy alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Olson. The way we'll proceed is to continue with the speakers and then have discussion after all three of the first panel have completed. The next speaker is Dr. Paul Robin Krugman, who is professor of economics at MIT. He's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He served as an economist on international policy with the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the early 1980s. He's on the Los Angeles Times Board of Economists and has written numerous studies on exchange rates, market structures, strategic trade policy, and foreign investment. Dr. Krugman.
Okay, I'd like to start by thanking Wafer for inviting me and saying how flattered and pleased I am to be at this session. I say that as a prologue to saying that I hate the title of this session, and in fact object to it vociferously. By talking about regaining leadership in the world economy, I think we perpetuate a tendency towards a very wrong focus about what our economic problems are about and about what our economic policy should be concerned with. Maybe I can make the point by noticing that if it should happen that during the remainder of this decade Europe and Japan slip into deep, intractable depressions, whereas we merely limp along with a continuing recession of the sort we've been having, I guess you would say we've regained leadership in the world economy. It's not exactly what we have in mind. International economics is not a basketball tournament. It is not a question of winners and losers. And beyond that, our problems have got very little to do with the question of competing in the world economy. It's usually the case that an economist will come up and say, we need to pay more attention to international matters. Americans don't understand international competition. Actually, most Americans who think about it at all place much too much weight on the international side of our economic issues. I've had the experience of writing an op-ed piece for the New York Times talking about ways in which we might improve our productivity growth. And the editor with whom I dealt inserted after every mention of productivity growth in order to compete in the global economy. And I had to fight to take it out. The reason why you want productivity growth is in order to be more productive, not in order to compete in the global economy. This is not the right definition of the issues. It's worth remembering that first of all, that in all economies, all countries, at least 65% of value-added employment is in non-traded sectors, more than that in an economy as big as the United States. And it's worth remembering that if you try to account for any economic problems that the United States has had, any direct impact of failures of international competition in the sense of a reduction in our terms of trade, in the sense of our having to sell our goods more cheaply in order to buy what we need to buy, is a tiny portion of our difficulties. It's just not a major factor. Of course, the international economy, well, it's what I do for when I do real economics. I do international economics, so I guess it must be important. But since I know about it, let me say it's not that important. Now, what is the problem with the U.S. economy? It's our failure to deliver to ourselves. It's our failure to deliver an acceptable performance. And that performance has two dimensions. First, there's a long-term problem. Even abstracting from the current recession, the basic record is that the United States economy has failed to deliver clear-cut rising living standards for most people since the early 1970s, and has in fact delivered significant decline in living standards for quite a few people. The simple measure of that is, it's not quite so simple, but essentially median family income using an appropriate price index, not the figure you see, is up maybe 7% since from 1973 to the last business cycle peak. But the median family was working something like 10% more hours at that point, so that most people are, as the President-elect liked to say during the campaign, working harder for less money than they were before. And of course, at the bottom of the income distribution, people have suffered a catastrophic fall in living standards over those 20 years. On top of that long-term problem, we have the short-term problem, a recession, which is not the worst recession that we've ever seen, but is proving alarmingly persistent, alarmingly resistant to the usual medicines. So that we have to the longer-term problems a short-term problem, but the short term is trying to get a little bit long in the tooth, and that's disturbing us as well. What is the source of the long-term problem? Well, that depends upon what you mean by an explanation. You can back it up successive stages. You can ask first, in an arithmetic sense, how is it that most people are working harder for less money? And the answer is 2/3 of that is productivity. Productivity grew during the post-war, the good years, the post-war generation, about 2.8% a year. Since 1973, it's been more like 0.9% a year, with essentially no statistically significant break in that trend. That explains, as I say, if you think of us as having moved for the typical American from essentially getting real earnings gains in line with productivity growth during the post-war generation to essentially no gains since 1973. Two-thirds of it is because productivity growth has slowed sharply. There's still that gap between 0.9% productivity growth and actual falling earnings for a lot of people. And the other one-third is income distribution. We've seen a massive shift of income upwards along the scale, and such a shift always tends to lower the median relative to the mean, which explains why most people are actually not seeing any gains or even declines. So that we have the further paradox of a country which is substantially richer than it was, even with the slow productivity growth. We are a substantially richer country than we were 20 years ago, but we also have a lot more poverty, and that is because of the income distribution. On top of that, we have a recession, of course. Sorry, before I talked about the recession, let me go back to that. If you ask for a deeper explanation, you'd have to ask why the productivity slowed down and why the increasing inequality of income. And the answer to both questions is quite clear. We don't know. We don't really know. When we go down through the list of things, we may suspect that Mansur is right, that at some level it's all about institutional factors, but we haven't actually been able to find the axles and gears that connect that explanation to the actual mechanics of economic growth. If we take other growth accounting sorts of approaches, we end up finding that the residual is the major explanation of what went wrong. So we don't really know. And rather surprisingly, even on income distribution, while some fraction of it, typically a third or a quarter, may be attributable to international factors, increased imports of labor-intensive products from the third world, when all is said and done, we don't understand very much about what happened to income distribution either. So in fact, to be realistic, we're operating in something of a fog in terms of explaining the long-run problems. The short-run problems, I think, are a lot easier to understand. First of all, despite what people may say, we do understand recessions pretty well. We may not be able to make very good forecasts of turning points, but we do understand what happens in a recession pretty well. And there's a set of factors: corporate balance sheet problems, the difficulties of the banking sector, the incredible overbuilding of commercial real estate, essentially hangovers from the financial excesses of the 80s, that explain a lot of why we have this persistent recession. International factors have not entered into this at all. I didn't mean to reiterate that, but I don't actually see them as a key element in any of this story. I don't see any reasonable way to explain the productivity slowdown by an appeal to international factors. I don't see any reasonable way to explain the recession by an appeal to international factors. The reason why we want to increase our productivity and the reason why we want to get out of the recession is for ourselves, not to compete in the world economy. So I actually think, essentially, we have domestic problems. Can we, in fact, do better? Will we do better? That's partly a political question. But if all goes as we hope, can we do better under the Clinton administration? Again, break it into two parts. And first ask, can we do better about the recession? The answer to that is yes, yes, yes. One of the most disturbing things about discussion in the United States is the emergence of a kind of fatalism about the business cycle. You see an alarming number of people saying, well, you know, there's not much that the government can do about such things, and anyway, we have such deep problems from the 80s that we really have to go through this. A kind of view of the recession as a sort of purge for the 1980s. For example, you'll see people say that because of the parlous state of corporate balance sheets, there is no alternative but to go through an extended period of painful readjustment during which they get themselves back into financial health. If you back up and think about that for a second, and you say, well, what we're really doing is we're getting corporations to recall a bunch of pieces of paper that say on them debt and replace them with other pieces of paper that say on them equity, and you really assert that somehow 3 million extra unemployed must pay the wages of Michael Milken's sins for several years in order to change the labels on those pieces of paper, there's something very wrong with our economic management if that turns out to be something that's necessary. All we're really doing is some relabeling. I don't see any reason, any fundamental reason why it should be necessary to have massive real output loss during that transition process. And in fact, we do understand recessions pretty well. We may not be able to predict them very well. That's true about meteorologists and hurricanes, by the way. Meteorologists can't predict hurricanes very well, but they do understand pretty well what a hurricane is. We understand what a recession is, and unlike a hurricane, a recession is something we do know quite a lot of things to do about. And I don't see any reason why we should not be able to get ourselves out of this recession. And by the way, that means that the first Clinton administration is probably going to be a pretty good time economically if you measure it by growth rates. Business cycles are so big that they can dominate your picture of the growth performance over an extended period. You can ride for a long time on a business cycle recovery, especially if it takes place from a deep recession, as Ronald Reagan found out. Beyond that, and of course this could go wrong. This is an unusual recession. We don't know whether, we've tried some of the usual antibiotics and they didn't cure this infection. And so it is certainly possible that it could go wrong. But the odds are that it won't, that we will come out of it rather smartly in the end. What about the longer term problems? As I said, we don't know why long run growth slowed down so much. We do have a checklist of things that you ought to do to raise long run growth. And what it comes down to is investment. It comes down to investing in various things that are good for long run productivity. If you like, you can think of it as several kinds of capital. Ordinary business productive capital. It would be nice if we invested more there. The only way to do that is to save more as a nation to provide the resources for that. Education, human capital. It would be nice if we did more, especially if we did a better job of educating our children. It's not clear that the time or money is the crucial thing, although it matters. Public capital, infrastructure. There are some estimates which I find convincing, though not plausible, that suggest that there are very, very high rates of return on at least repairing our decaying infrastructure. And finally, you might sort of make a sort of vague idea of knowledge capital, technology. We have no idea whether any feasible policy with regard to these various kinds of capital would make a huge difference to our growth rate. But there's no excuse for not trying. There's no excuse for not trying to get the budget deficit down so that we have more saving available for private investment. No excuse for not doing what we can to help our educational system and related things like training and early intervention for preschool children and even unborn children. No excuse for not spending on things that look like productive infrastructure projects if we should point out how low our infrastructure spending is these days. If the program that the president-elect has proposed is a tax and spend program, then Dwight Eisenhower was a socialist. It's just a very small program by comparison with the kinds of spending that we used to undertake. And perhaps, treading very cautiously, there's a case for something which we can euphemistically call a technology policy to promote those sectors where it's likely that private investment in knowledge creation yields significant spillovers. We're going to do, it appears, at least a good part of the checklist. No aggressive assault is planned on the deficit, but the economic program announced during the campaign certainly calls for substantial investments in human capital and in infrastructure. How much can we expect from that? Well, I think one should keep one's expectations quite modest. Think about it in rate of return terms. If you put together all of the training, education, infrastructure spending that's proposed in putting people first, it's about 0.7% of GDP. There are good reasons to suspect that the rate of return on all of that spending is considerably higher than the average private rate of return on investments. But while the Clinton administration could be lucky and manage to find those magic catalytic investments that yield enormous rates of return, I think you would have to be a tremendous optimist to make as your central forecast that the social rate of return would be as high as 50% on all of those investments, which would mean that at a sort of wildly optimistic estimate, it would be raising our productivity growth by 0.3 of a percentage point, 3.5 of a percentage point. And bear in mind also that some of these are very long-term investments. Investments in education, by definition, are not going to show up in our productivity growth until the first or second Gore administration. Early intervention on preschool or unborn children, by definition, is not going to have any impact on our productivity until the first Hillary administration. So there's no way that these things are going to show up very massively in the short run, and I think we should understand that. Income distribution, I've pointed out, is a major part of the story, which doesn't mean it's a major part of the policy. It's very hard to, although we may deplore what's happened, it's very hard to think of any assault on inequality of income that won't undercut any prospects for a revival of productivity growth. And the best you can hope for is again, measures at the margin. To the extent that additional revenue must be raised, you may try to raise it in a progressive way. We can try to do things for the poor, although there hasn't been very much discussion of them in the past year. It's possible that an administration that is generally oriented towards people at median and below will, in a variety of small ways, tend to promote a more even income distribution, but it's certainly not going to be a policy priority. So the important thing, I think, is to realize that we have quite modest expectations of what government policy can do. Now, it's entirely possible that we will see a dramatic revival of productivity growth over the next decade, simply because, after all, we don't know why it slowed down, so it could just as well speed up for a reason we don't understand. And there's an argument that I'm very fond of, which is due to Paul David, economic historian at Stanford, who has pointed out that he's pointed out, as many of us have, the striking contrast between the business pages, let's say, of The Economist and the technology and science pages of the same magazine. Technology and science pages for the past 20 years have been full of wonderful things, fabulous developments in microelectronics, biotechnology, you name it. And somehow or other, we don't seem to be getting anything out of it. Whereas we have all this marvelous technological progress, the most creative era probably in the 20th century, and very little payoff. Well, what Paul David has pointed out is that it's actually typically true of major new technologies, that it's a long time before people quite figure out what to do with them, that electricity was used for relatively minor things until really quite far into the 20th century, before it really began to make a major impact on manufacturing productivity, that the technologies that drove the great post-war boom, which was a kind of intersection of electrification, automobiles, large retail supermarkets, which were made possible by automobiles and widespread refrigeration, and so on, were all technologies that were available, that had been invented very, very long before. So there's at least some hope that sometime in the next decade, or maybe the decade after that, we'll finally figure out what to do with those personal computers, aside from doing 17 drafts of the same memo, and that there will, in fact, be a great productivity revival. But as a policy matter, I think what we have to say is that our government has a major direct responsibility to get us out of the recession. Should not succumb to the fashionable fatalism that says that, oh, well, this is just something we have to go through for structural reasons. But on the other hand, we should not place unrealistic expectations on what we can do for long-run growth. We ought to do the right things, but we shouldn't expect that it will produce any spectacular payoff. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Dr. Herb Stein, who's a PhD from Chicago, had served with distinction in the government as an economist with the FDIC in defense-related economics positions during World War II. He was a fellow at Brookings and a member and then chairman of President Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors. He's professor of economics at the University of Virginia, also a weekly columnist and regular contributor to leading newspapers. Served in the 1980s as a consultant to the Department of State and the Congressional Budget Office. He was a member of President Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board and the Blue Ribbon Commission on Defense Management. He's affiliated with the American Enterprise Institute. He's an author and editor of numerous economic studies, including Governing the $5 Trillion Economy in 1989. Dr. Stein.
Well, you didn't mention my most recent book, and the only one that's probably in the bookstore, which is an illustrated guide to the American economy, done by my colleague Murray Foss and me, and he's here. I feel, being on the platform with all these young economists, I feel like Admiral Stockdale. But after all, he got 19% of the vote, and he ought to be represented. I'm not going to talk at all about what the new administration might do. This is the 10th transition that I've seen while living here in Washington, and when you've seen one, you've pretty much seen them all. I'm going to agree very thoroughly with almost everything that Mr. Krugman said. In fact, I'm going to go beyond him in one respect. He admitted to you that international economics is not that important. I'm going to admit to you that economics is not that important. I'm kind of stimulated to that thought because I've just been reading an essay by, I will admit, an essay by J.M. Keynes that he wrote and published in 1930, in which he said he looked forward to the day when economists would be like dentists, would be regarded like dentists, participants in a rather humble craft that could solve some minor problems, but not the total explicator of how the world works and prescriber of how it should work. Because when he wrote that, he was looking forward to a day, he said 100 years from then, when he thought the economic problem would have been solved because per capita output would have risen in that 100 years by between 4 and 8 times. Well, we're now 60 years into that 100 years, and we're probably right on track about his prediction of where we would be. So I imagine we are now 60% on the way to have solved the world's economic problem, and we can turn to other things. And I'm going to talk about other things mainly because I'm kind of hung up on the title of this program, which is about economic leadership, and which I think is a very ambiguous notion, and that's what I mainly want to talk about. And I would distinguish three notions of leadership. One is the idea of being ahead, as in a race, a leader in a marathon. He's a person who's ahead. He's not trying to suppress the other people. He's just trying to be there first. The second notion of leadership is the notion of having coercive influence over others, of having domination over others. And the third that I would distinguish is having an exemplary and persuasive influence over others. Now, with respect to being ahead, there's a lot is being said about that, a lot is implied about that, in all the talks about reviving the American dream, as if the American dream was to be ahead of somebody else. Well, are we ahead or not in this sense? Well, that depends, of course, on the standard of measurement, and the standard of measurement that I suppose most economists would find congenial. We are ahead, and that would be gross national product or gross domestic product, as these younger people say. Per capita, that's hard to measure, hard to compare among countries, but by the best measures we have, we are probably something like 20% ahead of the Japanese in per capita output, and perhaps a third ahead of the Germans. But there are other standards which have some relevance, even some connection with economics, for which we are certainly not the leader. Crime, educational attainment, life expectancy birth, infant mortality, drugs, illegitimacy, and certain other problems. It may well be that we will be overtaken in GNP per capita in not a very distant time. One can easily project that from current rates of growth in various countries compared with ours. I'm a little, I have my fingers crossed, I'm a little skeptical about that, because I can remember all the expectations we had and the fears, tremors that went through this city in the late 50s and early 60s about the expectation that the Soviets were getting ahead of us and the Western Europeans were getting ahead of us, and there may be, one should be cautious about projecting these rates of growth. But the main question is, why should we care? Why should we care if per capita output in Japan is higher than ours? It seems to me of very little significance to the average American or to any American. I sometimes say, and I have said many times, that I'm not concerned about the income of the average Japanese compared with the income of the average American. I am concerned, would be concerned, with the income of a 76-year-old Jewish economist in Japan compared with my income. But when I think about that, I don't know in which direction I should care. That is, should I be envious if his income is higher, or gratified that it's lower? If it's lower, he's less likely to come here and take my job. But anyway, we have our own problems. Mr. Krugman has talked about the income distribution problem. I would focus on that more narrowly, say that we have a problem of poverty in the United States, which is a problem not of the middle income people or of all those people whose incomes may not have risen in the 1980s, but the people who, say the 10%, 10, 11, or 12% of the population who do live in poverty in America. And we have these other social problems to which I have referred. I don't think that growing faster is the key to dealing with our problems. We have these problems despite the fact that we have, by any standard, an enormously high total average per capita income. And I don't believe that government is the key to growing faster. Mr. Krugman has pointed to the gains that could be had from increased investment, and I think properly put a rather low weight on them, a low multiplier on them, low rate of return on them. But the basic fact is that we're not going to get, except perhaps in a brief cyclical period, we're not going to get a lot more investment as a share of the national output unless we have a lot smaller consumption as a share of the national output. And I see no sign either in public policy or in private behavior that we're going to have that. For all the talk about increasing investment in America, nobody seems willing to stand up, nobody except, here I should return to my Admiral Stockdale role and say nobody except my colleague, Mr. Perot, talked about doing things that would reduce consumption in America, and I think that is a big problem. However, and let me turn to my second view of leadership, which is coercive leadership, and the search for domination. And that I think, that notion that we are in some kind of struggle for dominance is reflected in some recent books. One, of course, was a great bestseller by Lester Thoreau, which he called Head to Head: The Coming Economic Battle Among Japan, Europe, and America. There's another one by Mr. Garton called A Cold Peace: America, Japan, Germany, and the Struggle for Supremacy. Now, I haven't read either of those books. I no longer read books that I know I'm not going to like. But they do reflect a certain kind of bloody-mindedness and an attitude towards international economic relations. And that same idea, in a more moderate way, is expressed in Mr. Bush's statement during the campaign that he wanted the United States to be an economic superpower, which seems to me to suggest that he wants or wanted the U.S. to be in a position to use its economic power to coerce or dominate other countries, whether for good or ill, in the same way in which we used our military power. And there's some reflection of this in Mr. Clinton's suggestion that he wants an economic security council. That is the notion that the economic problem should be focused on some aspect of national security, or that we should look at economic problems as if they were an aspect of the problem of national security, which I will say I think is a rather dumb but probably harmless idea. Harmless in the sense that when the people responsible for economic policy get together, under whatever title they are given, they will deal with the same problems. There is a kind of notion around that that now that the Cold War has ended, military power is no longer of any value. That now that Japan and Germany have become wealthier than they used to be, they are our natural adversaries, and that we need to make our economic power greater in order to be able to exercise influence, defend ourselves against these potential adversaries, and exert influence in the world as we have previously done. I don't believe that any of that is true. The collapse of our main military adversary has not weakened the utility of military power, but has rather increased it while making it cheaper. As we could see in the case in the Gulf, that is, our military power was as useful as it was in the Gulf because there wasn't another great superpower out there to challenge us. We also have lots of examples of the fact that economic power has been of limited value in exerting influence in the world. After all, we've been exerting our influence, our economic power on Cuba for 30 years without as yet having much effect on them politically, and we have seen similar results, limited results in the case of Yugoslavia and Iraq. And anyway, there's a very false analogy between military power and economic power that people are led into. We have military power because we are willing to devote 5 or 6% of our national output to the development of a military structure and putting that under the control of the commander-in-chief and saying that can be used for the achievement of some national objective, some achievement of some objectives for which the state is responsible. But we are not putting the $5 or $6 trillion of the GNP at the hands of the commander-in-chief. The President of the United States is not the commander-in-chief of the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy is not an instrument that is at his disposal to use in the achievement of some national objective. The $6 trillion of GNP is the GNP belongs to 2.5 million people, and that is not 250 million people, excuse me. And that is no longer more a power that can be exercised in implementing some state purposes than it would be if each of these 250 million people owned a Stinger missile. That would not constitute a military power. And anyway, the fact that these other countries are becoming richer does not hurt us and does not make them our adversaries. And here I would quote from David Hume, who said, referring to somebody, "In opposition to his narrow and malignant opinion, I will venture to assert that the increase of riches and commerce in any one nation, instead of hurting, commonly promote the riches and commerce of all its neighbors." 1787. So I come to the third definition, meaning of leadership, which is leadership by example and persuasion. Now, the necessary requirement for being a leader in that sense is to lead. The necessary requirement is not to be faster and stronger than somebody else, but to be more aware of what is to be done in the general interest and more willing to bear the cost and the risks of doing it. That means you have to point the way that others will follow because they see it in their interest to do so. And we should then, and you are willing to bear the risks and costs of going in that direction. That was how we exercised leadership after World War II. I don't think it was because we were richer. We were willing to bear some costs and risks, but those costs and risks after World War II of establishing the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the GATT and the Marshall Plan and NATO and so on were, even in gross terms, small, and net terms, zero or negative for us, and the rest of the world, we did not coerce the rest of the world into following. I think the rest of the world was persuaded that it was in their interest as well as ours to follow to the pattern that we laid out. And so what I think is necessary for us to be a leader in that sense now is that we need a view of, as somebody said, the vision thing, we need a view of a world economic order that we think would be generally beneficial and that we should try to lead others to. That view, I think, in some ways, Mansur Olson outlined that, and I would agree with that, as a view of a multilateral and liberal trading system. Nothing has been said about this, but it is also, we need some view of an acceptable world monetary system. We are now kind of treading water in that respect. We get together heads of the major countries, finance ministers of the major countries every 5 or 6 months and try to decide what to do next without any general principle of guidance. I think we need to try to reestablish or try to establish for the first time some principles of a world international monetary system. I think we need to be refocused on the problem of the very poor countries. One of the figures that impressed me most in the work that Mr. Foss and I did in producing our recent book is derived from estimates of by Angus Madison, but that 2/3 of the world's population live in countries with per capita incomes 20% or less of ours. Now that, it seems to me, is a staggering fact of political and moral importance. I think we need to be concerned, as Mansur has said, with the reconstruction of Eastern Europe and of particularly of Russia and Soviet bloc countries that have broken up, and there are other matters, including the environment, in which we need to have a more constructive view of ourselves as the originator and leader of ideas that we think will be of general benefit and which can be accepted by the rest of the world as being of general benefit, and not in a competitive, hostile, bellicose posture with respect to the rest of the world. And in my opinion, to take such a role of leadership does not require that the United States should be any richer than it is, or that it should be getting richer any faster than it is. Those are good things, but they're not, from our standpoint, and given the current state of the affairs, the primary requisite for our taking leadership. Thank you.
We'll now proceed to a discussion portion until 10:30. I guess we should begin by asking Dr. Olson if you'd like to defend the title of the conference. Or
Well, I think that the fact that so many of you are here says there's something to be said after all for the title of the conference. That it may bring out concerns that we all have about the American economy and its role in the world economy. And I would suggest in this connection that we have to ask, when has the world economy worked well? And when has the world economy worked badly? Well, one time the world economy worked very well was in the 19th century and the years up to World War I. And it worked well then because there was one country, one empire, the British country of Britain, the British Empire, that worked hard to make a liberal international trading system, to act as lender of last resort when banks had trouble, and the world had a liberal economy in that period, and the world worked well, and it was partly because of the leadership of the British. Now the world economy worked well again from 1945 till about 1970. And I think all of the measures that Herb Stein mentioned, much of which were due to American action, had a lot to do with that. So while leadership must, of course, be persuasion and not coercive, I really think there is a need for economic leadership, and there's no country other than the United States that would be able to provide all of it.
Does anybody else on the panel have
I'd
any
like to
follow-up
make
comment?
a comment. This is very little to do with policy, because I think we're all free traders here. But I think it is worth realizing that economists in general are obsessed with free trade to some extent, since there are shortages of intellectual energy at the expense of other issues, and the general policy-making community, if you like, is obsessed with international issues at the expense of other more important issues. Let me give 2 points. The first is, by the way, fact is that during this liberal trading regime of the late 19th century that we all like to talk about, the United States, which was the most successful economy, had an average tariff of 40%. I mean, the United States was the most protectionist country, and far more protectionist than it is now. So it is not the British had free trade, but we didn't by any means. Now, it's true that we had a flat tariff for the most part on things. We didn't have this kind of elaborate quantitative controls and all the rent seeking that many developing countries now have. But still, we shouldn't make a myth that isn't true. But anyway, if you look at microeconomic policies, you look at policies that actually involve discretionary, detailed policy making as opposed to things like monetary policy. International trade policy is our cleanest. It's far and away our best. It's enormously better than, let's say, the way we handle water rights. And the distortions that we impose through what remaining protectionism we have are actually much less than the distortions we impose in water rights or land use or, let's not even talk about health care. Why are we so fixated upon the dangers of protectionism? Why is free trade such a central issue in economic discussion? I don't think it's because there is actually any real evidence or theory that suggests that that's the most important microeconomic area. It is because it's the crown jewel of economic analysis. When Paul Samuelson was once asked, what do economists know? Give me an economic concept that is both true and not obvious. The only one he was able to come up with was comparative advantage. That's something that economists know that the general public doesn't know, and that's why we, as a profession, are more committed to free trade than we are to all sorts of other things that our theory actually tells us are also important, but we're not able to place so much focus. That in a way shouldn't make a difference, because free trade is what we want anyway, and by all means, let's go for it. But I think that the tendency to focus on the international side, because it's glamorous, because it's exciting, because it's easier to sell, leads to some real costs. If the policy intelligentsia of Washington during the 1980s had paid as much attention to that boring, dull domestic issue of the thrift industry as it did to the ultimately much less important for the United States issue of third world debt, we would all be in a lot better shape today.
Dr. Stein?
Well, I'd like to say a word in behalf of the argument for free trade, even accepting that its economic significance is small. I think the problem about alternative policies, other than the free trade policies, is that they do generally involve you in struggle with other countries with which you do not want to be in struggle. That is, can't see of any other general rule that would be obviously acceptable to all. If we're going to take the position that we're all going to be fighting about who makes the airplanes and who makes the computers and so on, if these are matters of hostility, the attitude that's involved in this kind of protective posture does generally come with a kind of anti-foreign attitude, an attitude of hostility to others. I think that's a bad thing. As I read Kissinger in describing his attitudes when he was Secretary of State, he was always concerned about these economic squabbles, not because he thought they were of any economic importance, but he thought they poisoned the atmosphere for international relations generally, and I think that's something to be avoided.
Dr. Olson?
Well, Paul Krugman mentioned that the United States had relatively high tariffs in the 19th century when our economy did relatively well. And that's true, but I think in an important way misleading. And the way in which it's misleading we can best see if we have the thought experiment of imagining a world that was only two countries, one very gigantic and the other tiny, because this will tell us about the economic consequence of the size of nations. Suppose the world, there was one country that was all the world except Luxembourg, and then Luxembourg. Now let's perform the thought experiment of supposing the most protectionist possible policy of the gigantic country. Let's suppose no trade of any kind is allowed, autarky. What would happen to the gigantic country? Well, obviously very little, because there wouldn't have been much it would have bought from tiny Luxembourg anyway, not much it would have sold to tiny Luxembourg anyway. So in this case, the level of protection would matter very little indeed. Now, even in the 19th century, the United States was a gigantic economy, and it was that gigantic size and its constant growth that enabled it to be unique among the countries of the world in achieving a thriving economy with lots of exports of manufactures and other things, notwithstanding high protection for a long time. Now, to check on the importance of this idea that we underestimate the importance of protectionism and underestimate the significance of the international economy, to test that, I looked at the trade of small and medium-sized countries as it was affected by protection. Particularly looked at exports of manufactures of small and medium-sized countries on the theory we can learn more about the effect of this if the country isn't so gigantic, because in the big country so much of the trade will be internal anyway. And I found with data for the early 1970s, which were available, that there was not a single small and medium-sized country on which there's data in all the world that succeeded in exporting any significant percentage of its manufactures. That is to say, there are many countries like Argentina, Mexico then, India, all sorts of countries which had given a lot of emphasis to manufacturing and had protected their manufacturing sectors and produced a lot of manufactures, used a lot of their resources to produce manufactures, but they could sell usually only 5% or so of their manufactures on the world market. By contrast, other countries and areas like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, the small countries of Western Europe in the European Free Trade Area and in the common market, these countries would export something like a third or 2/5 or half of all of their manufactures. I hypothesize that in the small country, cartelization and special interest measures led to manufacture, protected by the tariffs, led to a sclerosis of the manufacturing sectors of these countries, which made them inefficient. So that's the reason why we've never had small countries with lots of protection that have become thriving economies with lots of exports of manufacturing. Generally, if we look across the third world and the first world together, we find that trade policy matters a very great deal to whether economies are successful or not.
Why don't we turn now to, unless somebody from the panel wants to respond to questions from the audience, and see if anyone else has anything to ask or comment. Yes.
Well, I would like to comment on this debate about the importance of an open international trade policy on the domestic economy. I'm a development economist with AID, and I have always argued, and I think in my own mind at least correctly, that the importance of an open economy and an open trading regime within a developing country, or any other country for that matter, is not so important for its own export potential, which is, okay, important enough, but it's more important because of its effect on the domestic economy itself and what it implies for the policies that allocate resources for investment into productive ways within that economy itself. In other words, it's back to the principle of its own comparative advantage, but even more so, whether or not it places a value on its own, if you will, factors of production that is appropriate for its own welfare. And what you find, I think, as has been said already, that with protectionist policies, you sort of protect a hothouse economic situation, which really is not sustainable on world markets and really promotes investment in the wrong sectors and wrong activities within those sectors of the economy. Whereas with a more open system, investment allocation becomes more effective, more efficient, and it moves the domestic economy, which admittedly is much larger in almost all of these countries, ahead more rapidly. And I think the same thing must be true of the United States as well.
I think we're not, I mean, we're not arguing about the virtues of free trade. And of course, the smaller the country, the more important it is. That's also clear. The question is, should that be the, let's put it this way, should we consider an open trade policy as the prime test of whether you're following a policy that promotes economic rationality and growth? Should we say that provided that we've managed to get the GATT negotiations moving forward, start a new round, and in general manage to preserve an open trading system, that means that we're doing well on policies for efficiency? And the answer is no. There are several other issues which are as important or probably more important. We spend more on health care than we do on imports, and our expenditure on health care is vastly more distorted than our expenditure on imports. The microeconomic importance of getting our health care policy right is substantially more important than anything we might do in trade negotiations over the next 4 years.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question for Paul Krugman. I found one of your statements about the impact of international trade on income distribution intriguing and perhaps a little disturbing. You said that about a third or 1/4 of the worsening income distribution in the U.S. could be explained perhaps by the fact that you had an open trade regime, especially to third world countries that have labor-intensive techniques. And you said that was small. However, when the situation has been worsening for this bottom, the bottom of the population, then that may not be so small. And then you said that there can't be much done actually to improve income distribution. So in some way, you presented a situation in which the argument in favor of protectionism, to protect the bottom 10% or 15% of the population, might be put forward. So my question is, how do you reconcile the fact that you want to have an open trade regime with at the same time improving the conditions of the bottom 10 or 15% of the population?
I guess we just think that that's a policy that's out of bounds. That the consequences for, I mean, among other things, if you care about social justice, then protecting, it's a terrible thing to say, but protecting is to project to raise the incomes of American workers earning $4 an hour at the expense of depressing the incomes of third world workers earning 10 cents an hour is not a very, if you have any sort of global vision of this, is not a very good policy. In fact, international trade policy is part of a network of international relations. That's why it's so much cleaner than our other microeconomic policies. It's precisely because Henry Kissinger would intervene on trade policy affairs and not on distribution of California water rights that the pricing of imports is so much more rational than the pricing of water. Unfortunately, it is true. I mean, we've known this since Stolper and Samuelson. It is true that imports of labor-intensive products do reduce the real wages of unskilled workers. Economics is not a morality play. There's no guarantee that things that are good for efficiency or things we might approve of in general have entirely desirable effects. It's just the price we pay.
Yes.
An economist with the Federal Reserve Board. Various people on the panel have alluded to some of the areas in which there might be room for increased international cooperation. Herb Stein discussed the monetary system, and various people have referred to trade and the GATT. And I was wondering, is there any room for international cooperation in technology policy, which Paul alluded to? In general, my thinking would be that nations have an incentive to cooperate when the benefits from investment in one country spill over to other countries. Under those circumstances, one country will tend to underinvest in whatever that particular investment is, because some of the benefits will accrue to other nations and people in those countries. It seems to me that technology is a prime example of precisely this kind of an investment, where it's very easy for one country to copy the technology that was developed in another. This would suggest that each country individually will not be providing sufficient funds for research and development, and that it would be in the interest of countries to get together and say, let's jointly increase our spending in this area, Whereas then this tends to run a little bit counter to some of the idea that, well, we have to spend more on technology in the U.S. to get ahead of these other guys. In fact, we all benefit from each other's spending. I hope the panels could respond to that.
Yes, why not? And that's totally unobjectionable.
Well,
Good question.
but you do have a problem. I mean, are we talking about the technologies that every firm that invests in technology is making advances that might spill over to the benefit of somebody else? So are we saying, following the logic of what you're proposing, that the investment of every firm then becomes a matter for some higher level decision, or for some that is that the competitive system does not properly make decisions about the amounts of investment in technology, and that's a very far-reaching conclusion to come to. It seems to me. It seems to me that we have generally thought that there was some area, some kinds of research where the internal benefits are relatively small as compared to the external benefits, and where there was a subject for public concern. And in those cases, I think the point that concern ought to be international is correct, but I'd be a little worried about how far you carry that, because everything affects somebody else.
There's a question back here.
I have a question about interest rates. We've gone through 2 decades in which nominal interest rates were very high and real interest rates were very high, and they've now come down. I'd be interested in the views of the panelists on how important low interest rates are, and if or how important interest rates are, and if they are now at a sort of good level, or whether they should be lower, and if so, how to make them lower. Thank you.
Well, I think interest rates now are too high, just as evidenced by the fact that we're not operating at potential, and I think that they would become lower if we had a more rapid growth of the money supply. And in the longer run, assuming that you are operating at potential, interest rates are the product of the supply of saving and the demand for investment. And I think what people are talking about when they talk about trying to reduce the deficit and increase private saving is to make funds available at lower interest rates so that there will be higher rates of investment. So I don't see anything more to say about that.
Go ahead.
It would be nice to get out of, I mean, we do need to get out of this recession. The cleanest way still is as much as possible through monetary policy rather than fiscal. There's a widespread view that monetary policy has been proven ineffective over the last year and a half, and there's some warrant for that, but it is true that the Federal Reserve still has 275 basis points to go.
One more question, and then we'll take our break back here in the middle.
I just wanted to pick up on something that Dr. Olson said earlier on, which is actually a political issue rather than an economic issue. You mentioned that special interests have an impact on an adverse impact on the formulation of economic policy, and that you felt that the president, because he represented a much broader constituency, can you hear me?
Yes.
That the president, because he represented a much broader constituency, would have some ability to counteract that. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you to think about was the fact that the constituency that the president represents is a very passive constituency, whereas each congressman has much more direct contact with the constituents in his district, and there's much more of a kind of a direct relationship between what the constituent wants and what the representative actually does. And I wanted to ask you to think about what ways the president might explore to begin to generate a more interactive or more active kind of relationship with this constituency that he has created through the election, basically talking about the transition from election to governance.
Well, the Chinese have a proverb that when there are floods and the levees fail and the irrigation systems fail, other natural disasters like that, that's a sign that the gods are dissatisfied with the emperor. Now, I don't accept that particular set of myths, but I'm glad those myths were around. I think the world works a lot better when people do, as they normally do, hold the man in charge responsible for whether things are going well or not. Now, it's true the prosperity of an economy depends on various things besides the policy of the government. It's also true in our political system, the policy of the government doesn't just depend on the president, it depends on other things as well. So of course there can be injustice sometimes to a particular president if he's defeated because he comes up for election when the economy is doing badly. But that's an injustice I think we wouldn't want to lose for anything. The fact that Hoover and Carter and Bush failed of re-election because the economy was bad sends a signal to every president that you're better off making the economy work. And you'll do that by having a set of policies that are impartial across industries, openness and encouraging competitiveness, and therefore I think the relationship between the president constituency can be passive, that it is perfectly appropriate for the people to hold the president accountable. On average, we'll be better off if the electorate does that.
We're going to take a 10-minute break now. I ask those of you who have your hands up to hold your questions until the end of the next panel, and we'll reconvene at precisely 10:45.
I'm giving it too much credit. Yeah, but it's actually, people using that actually, it's probably a lot of